This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome everybody to the first fall meeting of the Masha Raskolnikov fan club. No, this is actually book sandwiched in. But normally Masha would be, Professor Raskolnikov would be presiding over this in her capacity as our conscientious and compassionate but stern director of undergraduate studies. I'm sure most of you know her in that regard. But since she's the speaker today, I will just introduce her very, very briefly. I'm Roger Gilbert. I'm the chair of the English department. And I think you all know Professor Raskolnikov, but I'll just say a couple of things. One of which is that this has been a great year for Masha as a teacher, because in this spring she won the Russell Distinguished Teaching Award and the Class Council's Teaching Award, and she deserves every teaching award that is. She is an incredibly inventive and resourceful teacher. She's been reinventing our sort of foundational survey course 2010, which she's now renamed Dragons, Green Knights, and the Origins of English Literature. How many of you were in that class? Good to see you here. Yes. She regularly teaches courses on Chaucer. She teaches a course called Pleasure and Danger, the Body as Text. You taught that last year, right?
Last fall.
Yeah.
Probably next fall.
Good. She's the author of, I think you're going to tell people about your book, but I'll just say she's the author of a book called Body Against Soul, Gender and Soul, how do you say it? In Middle English Allegory. I guess she'll tell a bit more about that and her current work. I do want to mention, and you'll probably say this too, but I'll just mention that she actually got her PhD not in English but in rhetoric at Berkeley. And are you going to explain what that means, or is that not part of your...
I'll stick that in.
Okay. Where she worked with, among other people, the famous Judith Butler. I think one of the few academics who has her own fanzine. So I don't know why I keep harping on fans and fan clubs and that sort of thing. I just somehow think of you as having a fan base. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's all I'll say. So
Roger, that is so lovely. I'm so happy to be introduced by you. Can everybody hear me and my loud booming voice? It's a little bit hard for me to talk sitting down. At some point I might have to stand up. But the point of Books Sandwiched In, I guess the one thing Roger did not say, welcome. The point of Books Sandwiched In is that you will come back for others, even though some of you are really here because you're my special advisee chickens. But in fact, the idea is for you to build community in the English department. The English department at Cornell is huge and mighty and full of students, and it's good for us to know each other. It's good for us to support each other. We are often isolated in a sea of engineers. We're often isolated in a sea of business majors. Some of us might also be business majors, but I want to hold the flag for books, which I always say this, are not only here to be sandwiched in, books which are here for us to make our lives with. So I wanted to start today. These talks are weird. If you haven't been at one before, and most of you have not, these are kind of odd autobiographical talks, the kind that professors usually don't give. So instead of having a written text before me, which is what professors generally hide behind, something with beautiful sentences already written painstakingly in the middle of the night, I am actually holding a small yellow piece of paper and some props. So that'll be fun. But I wanted to start today by telling you, because you are those people who showed up for this event, why is my name Raskolnikov? That is a story that I have been promising to tell you. Those of you who are my faculty friends, there's a few of those. I've said, if there's ever a really boring moment in a dinner party, ask me. This is a good, detachable story. But the point of the BSI is also a little bit to tell you why your professors became professors, like what it is that made them do this. Why do they love what they love so damn much? And so for me, that story goes back to the Ukrainian shtetl, where my illiterate, useful to know, grandmother and grandfather met and joined the communist revolution. At the time, my grandfather's name was actually Hanner, and that is the name that probably I should have. But when he joined the Communist Revolution, I think he did some stuff he would not later tell us about. This is actually true, Roger. He really had to go underground and conceal his name, and he took the name Raskolnikov as a pseudonym. What was funny about this in my grandfather is that he really did not know what the name meant. And my name has become something of, I'm afraid, a literacy test for instance, sometimes my colleagues who sometimes don't know what it means either. Raskolnikov is the name of an axe murderer. It's the name of a famous axe murderer in a novel called Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. The axe murderer in question is an intellectual who is an impoverished graduate student who kills his landlady as she comes up to ask him for his rent. I have been in those situations, but I have not killed my landladies. Raskolnikov is a famous axe murderer who spends the rest of Crime and Punishment agonizing about whether he should turn himself in. One of the things to know about me is that this name, I think, marked my family the way like a large traumatic event might mark them. My grandparents were communist revolutionaries who learned to read by fighting for it. My grandmother really did learn to read as a cleaning lady in a Russian high school for boys. She was a Jewish woman cleaning the floors, and she really did learn to read by eavesdropping. And she really had to fight for that education, as my grandparents on my other side had to fight for their literacy and their education. Just being able to read is a privilege. And I actually am grateful for that privilege every day. So they had never read Crime and Punishment, my grandparents, when the name became their last name. And actually, as a weird postscript, they hadn't even known the book existed because they were really far from literary culture. It wasn't their culture. Instead, what they knew is that there was another guy named Raskolnikov, a Russian communist. So they were Jewish communists who needed to conceal their Jewish origins. But there was this Russian aristocratic communist who had taken the name Raskolnikov, probably in a paroxysm of self-pity. Oh, I am like the axe murderer, but I'm an aristocrat, and fought for the Russian Revolution, and was eventually suppressed by Stalin and written out of history. So that stories about the other family whose last name is Raskolnikov, all of whom were exterminated by Stalin in the 30s, those stories are actually just surfacing now, while my little obscure Jewish family has just proceeded to come to America and become college professors for the most part. My older brother is a college professor. Well, he's a law school professor. I do this. There's a thing that happened by taking the name Raskolnikov where my family got pushed towards literature. In Russia, my father was a high school teacher of Russian literature. He hadn't been able to go to college the way you guys get to go to college. He couldn't get a BA because as a Russian Jew, he was excluded from a liberal arts education. He went to teachers' college, which were better in Russia because all the Jews were relegated to them. And so his BA was from teachers' college, and he did not ever get the time and space to read. He had to snatch that space. He worked in a factory and went to teachers' college as night school. And let's call this preamble the story of how I got here. And now I teach at Cornell. I wrote the chapter in my book that became my writing sample that got me this job. That was the writing sample that they read and were like, hey, let's interview this girl. I wrote that while I was living in San Francisco. I'd been evicted from my home because the dot-com boom, it was the first round of the dot-com boom and rents had gone up, and a young hipster couple had bought our apartment and kicked us all out. So I ended up living with a crack addict in the Mission in a really small room beset by mice. And I was so scared the crack addict would sell my laptop for crack that I went everywhere with my laptop, which meant that I did a lot of editing on that chapter. And so then the whole first year I was at Cornell, I was like, I escaped the crack addict. And I'm here. So I have had a colorful life. That's not really anyway, so I wanted to tell you about the Raskolnikov, and I wanted to tell you about the privilege of reading. And I wanted to tell you about how my father fought for his education in the face of just a structure that said Jews should not get liberal arts educations. They just are not, universities are not available to them. They are available for ethnic Russians because ethnic Russians should study ethnic Russian literature. Sometimes people say to me, why, if you are Russian, and I always say in Russia, I'm not a Russian. In Russia, I'm a Jew. In Russia, they don't want me. But in America, people think I'm a Russian. why, if you're a Russian, do you study medieval English literature? Like, what does that have to do with you? Why don't you study your own people? And I say, well, that's the thing. My father was always told he needed to study, what? Jews, because he was a Jew. And that narrowness is something that I try to avoid. I think that all of our heritage is for all of us. The English language gives you access. I'm assuming we all share the English language at least. Gives you access to this wealth that you can just own, whatever you come from, whoever you are. So for me, English is a second language. I came here when I just turned 7. We left Russia when I just turned 6. We had a year of wandering. And then we came to America. Like, we got the news that we were coming the week I turned 7. I think maybe at my birthday party, but I feel like that might be mythical. And so I've been speaking English since I was about 10, because for the first 3 years I refused English. I would come to school with a big, thick Russian book and ignore my teachers and read in Russian, because I was not going to learn this damn language, and here I am. So arguably I've been overcompensating ever since by talking a lot. So that's part of the kind of backstory. That's the story of like how I ended up with the funky name. And it's a little bit the story of why education and literature and literacy seem like such important things to me, why I, as your DOS, I'm always like, take more classes, get an education. It's not just about what you do after, it's about what you just get to know, right? I feel these spirits of my ancestors hovering over me. Women denied education because they were women. Men denied education because they were Jews. Women who were not denied education because they were Jewish women, right? This crazy compilation of frustrated lives. And then I got to come to this country and do whatever the hell I wanted. So of course I ended up doing Chaucer. All right, so people who take classes with me know that I am a not very closeted Tolkien head, that like all that stuff about, I love that I'm making Roger laugh off to my left, that like all that stuff that is true of some of you is true of me. I read those books when I was 10. I never wanted to leave that world. I wanted to live and swim and be in it, but I never thought about being a medievalist. I really became a medievalist for a very different reason. So this was just always part of me, but I became a medievalist for a different reason, and I'll talk about that too. So I went to Berkeley, and I was on lots of fellowship. I was very lucky. Don't go to graduate school if they don't pay for you. I went to Berkeley, and in my second semester, I had an opportunity to TA on top of my fellowship, which meant extra money, with every penny of which I spent on books. I will be just totally honest. Like, that is where my library started. And I was TAing a class, an intro class on critical theory. I had gone to graduate school because what I had really fallen in love with was critical theory, which you may or may not be acquainted with in the English department at Cornell. What I wanted to do was study how we came to think that the things we think are common sense, what the underlying logics are of how language structures our thought. You know, these big questions, what it means to be a human being in a body, what it means that we are embodied and that our embodiments are different, what it means to ask how a work of literature affects us, what it means to ask how it affects the culture. So those were, I wanted to ask big, vague, general questions. And I spent about 6 months in graduate school just reading philosophy and being like, I'm in rhetoric and I can read philosophy and I'm going to know Heidegger and whatever. And then I TA'd for this critical theory class, and I was teaching this. I was teaching in a class that was, you know, the intro critical theory class. Some of you have taken. We have one. It's called English 2000, Intro Critical Theory. There's also one called Literary Theory on the Edge, which is secretly kind of the advanced version of that. But if you've never taken any critical theory, you can jump to that one too, and you'll figure it out eventually. So I was a TA for this class, and I was really high on myself. Everyone in rhetoric had like really cool glasses and really cool haircuts, and we all wore all black all the time, and boots. It was the 90s. Boots were big. They're not big right now because it's really hot out. But believe me, we wore big boots and big glasses. And I was like really in love with teaching. My father had been a teacher. My grandmother had spent time as a teacher in early communist Russia. I felt that teaching was my heritage in a way that I still feel that it is fundamental to who I am. For a brief moment, I contemplated leaving academia, and I was like, damn it, I can't not teach. If I leave academia, I'll just be a high school teacher. What's the point? And so, yeah. So I was TAing, and I had a student who came, and I was doing that thing. I'll do that with you if you come to see me. What other classes are you taking? I asked. What else are you doing? And that student was also taking Chaucer, and they were taking Chaucer with someone dull. Not the case for anyone who takes Chaucer at Cornell with anyone here, but this person was taking Chaucer with someone dull. And this person was like, well, Chaucer is nothing like all the stuff we're doing in critical theory class. Chaucer is boring and old. Ugh. And something came over me and I started ranting. It was just terrible. I was just like, I think it took another half hour, which I will spare you, for me to go through and say how every single school of critical theory that we had so far covered in class and would be covering could be done in a Chaucer course. Now, people took my Chaucer course. I don't really do that in Chaucer course because I've actually become like an honest-to-goodness medievalist now. But you could teach an intro critical theory just through Chaucer. Of course you could. You would talk about class. You would talk about, wait, I do that in class. We talk about race. You can talk about gender. You can talk about sexuality, like all the damn time. You can talk about all kinds of ideas about how the text unmakes itself. You can talk about the construction of the author. All that shit is all over Chaucer. In fact, you took Chaucer with me. It is all over Chaucer. It has just gone underground. I don't use the terminology anymore. But then I realized I have this special thing I can do. I can put together the medieval and the critical theory, and I can teach that. And I could teach that for the rest of my life without being bored for a second. And so that's what I did. And because I had not actually been a medievalist before then, and normally you don't start doing something like medieval literature second semester of graduate school, I had to stay in graduate school a little extra, and I had to work my ass off. I had to read all the books for that and all the books for critical theory. I had to fit in with the critical theory people in their classes. And I also had to make friends with the medievalists who tended to be like girls with really long hair who thought they were maybe Guinevere. I had to do both of those things. And I did. And I got here despite the crack addict. And that is my story. So that is like all the biographical stuff. Let me just back up for a second and say this, which is kind of important. Becoming a college professor is ridiculously hard. If you think that it's a fallback profession for the writer you want to be, don't do it. It's nobody's fallback. I think at some dawn moment, like when I was a senior, I was in a major where I could write a creative thesis. You know, English does not let you write creative theses. I was in a major where I could, so I wrote a really bad novel as a senior thesis. And I look back at that and I'm like, did I really think I was going to continue being able to write novels while getting a PhD? Not possible. And what I realized was it was going to kind of be a choice, and I chose the academic way, and that's pretty much all I've ever done since. You kind of have to give academia your heart and soul and guts. It won't take anything less. It'll make you move across the country from your family and your friends, and then move again once you're finished with graduate school. It is almost impossible to get a job, which means that you might find yourself spending your entire graduate career worrying about getting a job later and compromising yourself at every turn. Academia requires probably every waking moment of your time for probably 14 years of your life. And then you maybe get a little bit of a break. I'm on that break now. I got my PhD and then I got tenure. And then I really burned out hard because 14 years of doing pretty much nothing. I wouldn't let myself have a dog until I'd finished writing my book. Pretty much nothing but academia can leave you a little bit empty and a little bit socially behind. So I had to do all the stuff, like all the growing up stuff. I had to do it in the corners of academia, and I had to do it kind of after I got tenure, which is sort of nuts. I came to Cornell 4 months before I turned 30, and I feel like I was a child because all I had done was study for about 7 years by then. So not advocating that you do what I did. It is not easy, and it is not always pleasant. But it does allow you to live a life of the mind, which is something that is hard for me not to talk about as worthwhile anyway. So I'm going to talk to you now, it's this kind of thing, about my first book, Body Against Soul. I wanted to bring it and show it to you because it's this material object that is me. It is something that I made and something I can be proud of. Something that exists outside of me, gets interpreted by people who are not me. I don't even know who's read it and who hasn't read it anymore. Like for a while it was only being bought, by my friends, and then it lost my control, and then it was in a library, and then people could photocopy it, and I would really never know how many copies were proliferating. Probably not that many, let's be honest. This book came out of my dissertation, which is usually what first books do. My dissertation, I got really obsessed for my dissertation with something that is going to seem to you like a really obvious question, which for me brought together my critical theory and gender studies interests with the part of me that wanted to work on medieval literature. And that was this question of, what does it mean to be a being composed of material and immaterial substance? In the Middle Ages, they believed in a soul. We do not. But we still have no really good way of talking about what it means that we have a physical body that has like hormones and stuff that influence us, that has skin that shapes our experience of life, right? Like how tall I am has a lot, I'm not very tall, has a lot to do with the person I've become. Being white has a lot to do with the person I've become. Obviously, being Jewish is pretty important to me. And in Russia, that's considered a visible ethnic minority, so go figure. There's a lot of things that our bodies do to structure our lives, and yet there's something in us that we think exceeds the body. And we know that partly because some of us know that sometimes people die, and we have sometimes held dead bodies, and we have sometimes loved those bodies of the dead. And not to be a total downer in the middle of your lunch hour, but when I was finishing this book, my father had a stroke. And when he had the stroke, he was declared brain dead almost immediately. I had actually taught my first day of classes that morning, and my phone had rung a bunch of times, and I was mad at myself for not having silenced it. But I was like, why did my phone ring 3 times? That's nuts. So I walked out of class and called back, and my father had had the stroke. And all the children, my father's 3 children, had to come quick while his body was still alive to say goodbye to him, which I didn't really understand. This is really relevant for my first book, I promise. So my father was lying on a hospital bed, and he was gone. Right? He was completely gone, and yet he was completely there. So in the conclusion of my book, I got to have like a little self-indulgent moment. It is self-indulgent. Most of the book is really scholarly, and let me add like medieval and footnotey and like jumping through every possible hoop of being rigorous and knowledgeable. But I got to have about 2 paragraphs of saying, you know what this book really taught me? There was this moment when I held my father's hand, and my father's hand felt like my father's hand. But he was gone. And that line between presence and absence, what it means for whatever it is that we are, and we don't usually believe in a soul anymore, but whatever it is that we are and whatever it is that our body is complicated, because I loved that body and I was really sad when the machines were turned off. But the soul was already gone. Whatever there was already gone too. And that doubleness, the doubleness of presence and absence that the dead body holds, I didn't know this, but that was what I was working towards for the, God help me, like 9 years it took me to write this book. Even though this book is like all about footnotes and stuff. So what I wrote about were medieval debates between the body and the soul, where the medieval people, as part of teaching you to behave yourself, right? Like, shut up and behave yourself, says the medieval preacher. Let me tell you a story. Here's a dead body that I saw, and out of this body came a soul. And the soul stood over the dead body and said, it was all your fault, body. And it went on, the soul, and it said, you made all the mistakes. You had appetites. You wanted food in excess. You wanted sleep instead of church. You wanted sex that was inappropriate, right? You wanted all this stuff. And that is why we're now going to go to hell. And then in these medieval debates, these later Middle English debates, the body with a deep groan starts talking back to the soul. This is what my father's body could not do. But this is an extraordinary thing that the medieval imagination could do, which is to imagine speech by the body. Arguably, we think that voice is something that belongs to the living, right? You lose your voice when you're dead, but here the body speaks rhyming English and answers back and says, no, soul, it was all your fault. All the things that I did were what you did because you rode inside me. You were in charge. I am like a horse and you're like a rider, right? I'm just a robot and you're the person controlling the robot. It's a completely opposite version of what the soul and the body are. And so this complexity, the complexity of whether the soul is the robot controller / rider, or if the body is the thing with appetites that is always sort of blinding the soul. It no longer sees, it can only taste and desire the world in this way that the Middle Ages thought was bad, right? What the soul is and what the body is something that in the Middle Ages they spent a lot of time trying to work out because they wanted to know who to blame when you went to hell. In the end, the body sinks back down and rots. with some yucky details of maggots and things. And the soul is carried off by demons and tortured in hell, because in fact the soul is the one that gets punished harder. Although I would say that the consensus among critics is that the debate is not resolved. Like, no one can decide whether the body or the soul are really the ones who are involved. That's the game. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this in all kinds of weird and creative ways. This was the fun I had for many, many years, was producing this book. And the thing that I eventually figured out that was, to me, super cool, wait, let me take like a few steps. One of the things I figured out was that English did not have built-in relationships between body and soul. People who spoke English were more confused about it than people who spoke French. And that is because, and this is such an obvious thing, and in some ways it was obvious to me because my first language is Russian, but it is kind of an extraordinary thing to acknowledge when you're a speaker of English, and mostly a speaker of English. English does not have noun genders, right? An English table is neither female nor male, while a Russian table is female. An English chair is neither female nor male. These are always the dumb examples I use because I'm sitting in a chair at a table. You know, an English lamp is neither male nor female. What happens to us when we become male or female? Well, I had all this training in critical theory, and I could tell you that the terrifying, awful thing that is at the moment of your birth, actually now kind of at the moment of your first ultrasound, which, having had children, I know is like around 20 weeks, right? 20 weeks into your life. Someone looks at a dim picture of you, searches for a penis, finds one or doesn't find one, and says, it's a boy or it's a girl. And that line between boy or girl, or God forbid other, because then you're going to have to work it out, that line between boy and girl is sometimes treated as that which makes us human. Now that's fucked up, I don't like that, but it is true in Western culture, in a lot of cultures. Let's accept this terrible thing as true. But that means that when my table is female, I, as a Russian speaker, am moving through a different world, not that different, but just a little different world, where all the stuff around me has a gender. And I don't have to think about it because I instinctively know those genders. People who've had to learn Spanish, who have had to learn French, who have had to learn Russian. You know that you have to memorize those damn genders and they make no sense. They're not logical. But that's the cool thing about them. They personify, right? They make things into people because we make people into people by giving them genders in a fucked up way. I keep using fucked up, I'm sorry. Foul mouth, always been the case. Sorry, Roger. Private school, no one's gonna get me. So we do this thing that I think is wrong, but one consequence of that is for languages with gender differential, go out and notice this. There are built-in things that you can think about maleness and femaleness, bridges that are male or female, ships that are male or female, works of personification that we do. Well, English used to have noun gender. Old English, if any of you have taken Old English, Beowulf English, right, that 2010 English, beginning of 2010 English, it had noun genders. We don't talk about this in class because this is about my passions and it's whatever. It's a little limited, but English used to have them. And then the theory is there were so many damn invaders coming around and marrying and raping their way into different families that the grammar got all mixed up, and if the family couldn't agree if the table was a girl or a boy, they were just like, screw it, we don't need to gender the table, we can just say the table. And they stopped. So in between Beowulf and Chaucer, English loses this thing. So let me tell you how French language does body and soul. And you're going to totally get this. The French soul is female and the French body is male. Well then, it's a love story. I can explain a love story if I'm French. Are there any French people here I'm going to offend? The French and their ability to talk about love, right? It's a thing. And so what the French turn it into is the body is a cavalier who appeals to the soul who is a lady. And the lady says, ooh, you cavalier, you're full of yucky appetites. And, right? And the body says, no, you are the lady. You have always bossed me around and told me what to do, because that is the fiction of courtly love, is that the women are in charge. Ha. So all that mess is what they did with their body and soul. Well, that made it really easy for them and really hard for English poets who did not have that structural inequality built in. They just had the body and the soul. They did not come with gendered characteristics. And so what I end up arguing, what I really want to argue a lot, is that the absence of gender in English in English literature, has structured English literature, has structured allegory, those moments, personification allegory, those moments when we take abstract concepts and make them speak. We still have the Statue of Liberty built by the French. We still have the Statue of Liberty in the harbor, right? So liberty is still a little bit female. Justice. There was this moment that I loved, but this is not long ago, when the Attorney General of the United States wanted them to cover the breasts of Lady Justice because there was a naked Lady Justice on the podium behind him. I forget his name now, it was a long time. Was it Ashcroft? So I wrote about that, and then I had to take it out because it's too dated now. But he had this naked boobies behind him, and he couldn't handle it. Because justice tends to be represented as female. This is because of Latin noun genders, right? Like, it all comes from that. And so we have some retention of these female figures that are women who are more powerful than any real woman or any man. These particular statues of grandiosity, and I wrote about those, but that doesn't stop us from oppressing actual women, and it doesn't really help us structure the relationship between the body and the soul. So this is the fun I had writing my book. So I'm going to send my book around because I wanted to show it off. There's no good reason. And then I want to show you this poem, and I want to tell you about it, which is kind of a weird thing to do, and I think I will close on that, actually. So this is a poem I found on the internet when I was hyper-Googling to procrastinate on my book writing. You know you've done it too. It is a modern poem by a completely obscure, unheard of poet. In fact, at some point, I chased this poem down because I was going to quote it in my book, so I needed the footnote. And so I found out that Marsha Lee Anderson had taught Renaissance literature at like community college level. She had been closeted within her own family, but had lived with a female partner, which seemed fabulous to me. I, too, am a lesbian, in case you are the few people who don't know that. And she wrote this BodySoul Debate because she knew the same literature I did, but she just happened to be kind of good at this. So I'm going to read you this poem because I think it does the things that the BodySoul Debates do, but does it in a funnier way. So it resituates, this poem was written in the 80s, but it resituates the debate of the body and the soul to a clearly urban tenement building in 1949. Soul. I loathe this tenement. Such a facade must have had a union architect. Yay, Labor Day. It can't have been God. Body, you again. You on the second floor. Bohemian communist. Why won't you learn to shut your door? Soul, why don't you cultivate a little tact? Your rudeness isn't worth so high a rent. Why do I have to pay so high a rent? Why am I always forced to hide the fact I'm heaven sent? The door is warped. Wouldn't I like it shut? I find the sounds of your infernal plumbing unbecoming. You talk of rudeness. Why make me the butt of your unearthly cheek? I'm sick and tired of cooking, cleaning, mending all day long just to be kept awake all night by song you call inspired. Forget just once to pay, accursed soul, and watch me skip to the office of rent control. My bones ache with hunting some device to force eviction. How long must I endure this constant friction? Soul friction? Such a word is much too nice. Last night, for instance, over your snores and sneers, I tried to fetch the music of the spheres, the one decent pleasure that I can afford. I just retrieved one chord, one burning chord. The radiator burst by God, and mice ascended the chandeliers. Oh, there he goes, says the body, in a poetic fit as smart as Lohengrin. If only he would quit trying to live up to being one of the boys. Stop that eternal noise. I wish I could afford to live alone. What would I give to move my bed around or moon about in music till 11, with none to care if I was off the ground? It would be heaven. I wish I could afford to live alone. What would a little privacy be worth? A place with a garden, oh, a little earth to call my own. So this woman, they are not going to find this woman in the library. This is a poem she wrote. I think it's going to be the memory of her. Her nephew keeps her poetry books and put this up on a website. I like to remember this dead person, long dead now, who wrote a poem that I really like. But I want to say, you see what I learned about the body and the soul? She knew it too. When body and soul decide that they want to live alone, you're dead. And so to be alive, the two have to be brought together somehow and permitted to love each other somehow despite the infernal plumbing of one and the annoying music of the other. And I tried to read the soul in a prissy voice because I think that's how she is. All right, so I'm open to questions. And obviously indiscreet and likely to answer anything you want to know. Do I even remember anymore? I think I have such vivid memories of so much of writing it, but not of the plot. It had something to do with a character, this is the 90s, who periodically changed sex without getting to choose that they were doing so. And so they went, I think that novel's been heavily, certainly written and written better. But this person was walking around part male, turning male, turning female without volition. It was what I was thinking about at the time. I don't remember, but this is the problem and why I'm not a novelist. There was no plot. It was just like I wanted to talk about this character. I was not a good writer, let's say. Okay, clearly if I'm willing to talk about that, whoo, that was not a kind question. I can talk about anything. Stephen.
Where do you see yourself if you weren't here right now?
Well, I was supposed to have also talked about my current book project, but I never got to it because I spent too much damn time on the first book project. I'm writing this book on apologizing, and presumably it continues some of my interest in what I call soul heal, which is like the literature of how to make yourself into a being, like a person, like the medicine of the soul rather than the medicine of the body. And I think apologizing is this complicated thing that both consolidates power, right? Like if I apologize and pretending like I'm in charge, I did the bad thing. I tend to apologize for everything, including the weather. That's how I know that apology is about being in charge. But in the Middle Ages, it's a way of becoming a poet. I will claim my work by apologizing for it, right? So that's one thing, and at the same time, it can be so devastating. And so that line between, right, that's what I like to do. I like to talk about the psychology of stuff, the psychology of literature, not the psychology the way they do it with rats and mazes. And so thinking about that in terms of the rhetoric of the apology is where I'm, in 5 more years, that book really should be done, but I can't even quite see it yet. And sometimes I think it's a long, impassioned essay and that I should just leave it be. You can also ask questions about the English department.
There are like 3 books that you recommend that every person read. What would they be?
Oh my. The question, in case you don't have a loud booming voice like me, or the hearing to hear a non-loud booming voice, is what 3 books would I recommend to everybody? I don't have an answer to that question, really. I can tell you, I can tell you that when asked a different question, I have a prepared canned answer, which is if anyone asks me what my favorite book is, and I sometimes give this book as a present to beloved students. Now students are going to start expecting that I give them this book. I think my favorite book, the book that I think is my favorite book is Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which I would never write about. I have nothing to say about it, but I think it is possibly like the best thing. In some way where we don't believe in the best thing in English, but I kind of that. I think the Canterbury Tales is damn important and good and fun and has everything that you ever needed to know about critical theory embedded in it if you just look. So that's 2, I guess, but so personal, right? Like not generalizable at all. And I can tell you that another way in which I became an English professor is that when I was in the 9th grade, my teacher had a Norton Anthology of poetry, the short Norton Anthology. It had a green cover. And I was really poor. I couldn't afford to buy that book. I didn't even want to ask my parents for it, which is ridiculous, but true. It's a paperback. It probably cost $50 at most, maybe less. And I type really fast, as well as read really fast. And I typed that book. I typed the Norton Anthology of Poetry, not all of it, but big, enormous chunks of it. I had access to a computer lab, the university computer lab. My father was by then an untenured, impoverished university professor on a temporary job. And I typed the Norton Anthology of Poetry into a computer file, which is now too corrupted to open. And I learned a fuck of a lot that way. God, I learned a lot that way. Wow, that was something. So Russians had always copied books. I had learned this from my great aunt Sophie, because Russians, often when a book was forbidden, they would pass it to each other in the night and copy out the book by morning and then pass it back. One of my aunts once fainted after a night spent copying Dr. Zhivago by hand. It's a very long book. She fainted on the subway, and her entire first, second, and third thought when she woke up was she about to send not just herself, but her entire family to Siberia for having possession of Dr. Zhivago, also a great book, but not. So I would say I had experienced all these people around me who talked a lot about what it's like to actually longhand write out entire books. I had never done it, but I did it for the Norton. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And that would be my third, very personal option. Are those the 3 books you should read? I don't know. Read To the Lighthouse, though. I think as things go, and you have to read it slowly, you can't read it fast. It'll do something to you, especially if you can read it slowly over the course of a fall day. First time I read it was like October break of my freshman year. It just totally broke me, but broke me like in a breaking open way, for what it's worth.
Throw something in, because what you're saying about copying out the poems, I did it recently with Alice Fulton, and she did that as a...
She did?
As a schoolgirl, yeah, I mean in high school I think, or maybe even earlier. She just would take poems she loved and write them out long.
Wow.
So it's a very intimate way of, I mean, obviously everyone should read poems aloud. That's a very important way to experience them. But if you really love a poem, just write it out yourself.
Yeah. And see, I typed them because I also wanted to get this entire fairly large book. But it would have really cramped the hand to handwrite the Norton Anthology. But to do it as a practice of being a poet sounds wonderful. Yeah.
She's the illusion that you're Shakespeare or Emily Dickinson.
Yes, right. There's that wonderful Borges story about loving. Is it about loving an author so much that you recreate so many of the conditions of their life that you just end up rewriting Don Quixote?
Yeah.
Right.
Don Quixote, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, Borges, not taught in the English department, but very important to read for pleasure.
You mentioned kind of like the gender, the chair and body and soul, but how do you think it does influence what you write in other ways, or how you teach as well?
I mean, I think the question was, how does my Russian heritage influence my work and my teaching? I would say, first of all, I think about what it means to speak English as a second language, and even in the English department, even at Cornell, there are a fair number of us who are in that position, for whom English has at some point been something mysterious and is now something less mysterious, but is something we grapple with. And I think it brings a kind of, in old-fashioned literary theory, we call it the alienation effect, right? Like, it's not just a given, it's not just common sense. I see English in a way that is different than other people see it because I had to learn it. I had to learn it with like blood, sweat, and tears. I vividly remember learning. I don't remember learning how to speak Russian, right? It happened. But I remember what it means to learn English, and that means I'm extra sensitive to what it means to learn and to have learning hurt as you do it and to have it feel like something you need to do to survive. I mean, those are some of the things that I think about a lot. I mean, I think that I am a worse grammar Nazi, although I find that the light use of Nazi might be a problem, because English is a second language, which means, like, if I can do it, you can do it, is sometimes what I think about English as a first language speakers. Right? Like you were born with this thing. Come on, use the full range of words. There are so many of them. They're so great. My father and I, when I was a child, had this thing where we would read Shakespeare's sonnets and argue about whether they were better in Russian or in English. So there was a recording of this. Apparently I'm talking about my father a lot today. There was this recording because the sonnet, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun," sounds prettier in English. In Russian, it sounds prettier because some of the really violent imagery that Shakespeare uses, her hair is like wires, her breasts are done. Some of that is so unpretty, and the Russian translator made it really pretty. So I've really thought about what it means to go back and forth between that translation, which made Shakespeare famous in Russia, and the original. One more thing about Shakespeare. My mother got to see a production of Hamlet in the 50s. That was one of those times when they did Hamlet as a critique of the state. If you think about Hamlet, you can see that it's possible to do Hamlet as a critique of the state. And there's actually a long, storied history of Hamlet being used to subtly say to the tyrant, you are a tyrant. But damn, it's dangerous, because the words are right there, and you have to keep saying, it's Shakespeare, it's not me, it's Shakespeare, it's not me. So my mother was at one of those productions. That was the It's Shakespeare, but not me production, where, what was happening in Russia, which was, pretty bad. Like, a whole part of my family was born in a labor camp. Like, it happened to lots of people. I could tell those stories too. I can keep going. But, like that, knowing that it's possible to take Shakespeare and stage him in such a way that Stalin is a little bit afraid, but can't say anything because it's Shakespeare, that's got to be something, right? That's a kind of power that literature has that I've never lost touch with because of the Russian part of what I know. It's not dead to me.
You mentioned that you started learning English or reading more English stuff when you were 10, and did you always know after that you wanted to get into that field? Did you have an aha moment where you realized you loved the language and wanted to pursue it?
So that's what point did I know I wanted to be a professor? I mostly thought I was going to be a writer, to be honest. For most of my childhood, I was going to be a writer, and I was going to be a professor to support myself, which is why I tell you guys not to do that. It's not actually the way to do it. So I thought I was going to be a writer for most of that time. And at the same time, I was really good at school. And I liked it. I liked the feeling of being good at school, which is, I think, the wrong reason to go to graduate school. But that's what I did. And I eventually started getting part-time jobs teaching, and I realized that I really loved teaching. I was tutoring, right? I would tutor kids on the SAT, and I'd be like, wow, that's fun, right? That's always that moment when you realize teaching is going to be your life. And then you just work around that somehow. Jesse.
What do you think should be done
Okay, so this is Jesse asking, what do I think should be taught here that isn't? Jesse and I have a long-standing argument about Hemingway and how he's not really taught here. I mean, that's a complicated question because, for one thing, what is the here? Is the here the English department or the university? Because I sure as hell can't talk about the university as a whole. I think that the humanities need to be valued more in the university, but that's a different conversation with my unair-conditioned, windowless office. And my classroom that has no air, and so we're trying to study while we don't have air and no fans. But that said, what should be taught here that isn't? Every professor decides for themselves what they're going to teach. Roger and I have incredibly little power over what they're going to teach and when. We have so little power, it's kind of a joke. And so the professors teach whatever the hell they want to teach, and so I can't desire something because that would mean either having to come teach it myself or having somebody else arise out of the foam to teach it. I will tell you there are lots of classes I would love to teach that I don't have time to teach. I taught a class on transgender autobiography. I taught it years ago. I taught it before the current transgender moment. It was an amazing class. People came out of that class and have gone on to, one of them is the Huffington Post trans stuff reporter now, which I'm really proud of her. People went on to do really interesting things, and lots of activism came out of it, and it was really great, but I don't have time to teach that class because I have to teach all those other things I need to teach. And I don't even have time to really keep up with trans literature well enough to teach the new trans literature that has come out since the last time I taught this class. God damn it. So I wish that was being taught, maybe by me, maybe by somebody else. We have a professor, Riley Norton, on leave all of this year, who can teach that, but he's going to teach it his way. So I want to teach it my way, but I don't really have time. I wish that, you know what I wish there was? I teach at Cornell. I don't teach at a small liberal arts college, but I went to a small liberal arts college. I went to Wesleyan, and what I loved was the classes that mixed times, that started out in the Middle Ages and ended up in modernity. Those were really fun classes. We don't teach them because at a research university, you feel like you should be teaching your specialty. I should teach Chaucer because I know Chaucer like the back of my hand, and if you put me teaching Virginia Woolf, I'll be a little lost. So I only take that risk for freshman writing seminars. In freshman writing seminars, I typically start with antiquity, go to the Middle Ages, jump to something in the 19th century, and then jump to the modernity. And it's really fun, and it's a rollicking ride. But that you can't do that for an advanced class, and I kind of wish that that were a way we taught, because it would be fun, but it would be so unprofessional. You know, like it would be so not research university of us. And so it's probably unlikely to happen. And I don't know if students would want that, because it would be also unprofessional stuff to study. Does that answer your question, kind of? It's still not Hemingway, though. Whom I despise.
I give you permission to teach that course.
Yeah, but like, what course is it? Like, So for instance, like my medieval mentor as an undergrad, because I took some undergrad medieval classes, taught a class called Women and Solitude, right? And it ended up with Virginia Woolf. But can you do that?
Yes. Why not?
Yeah. All right.
I think there's room for thematic courses. Yeah.
Some. So I teach this class called The Body, which is my other favorite class. I'll be teaching it in the fall next year. Pleasure and Danger, the Body as Text. It comes out of all that stuff I do that does not fully get encompassed by medieval literature. I recommend it highly. It's a class about being a person. And this spring I'm teaching a super advanced honors seminar / grad class called Not Male in the Middle Ages, which is premised on the idea that in the Middle Ages you were either male, which meant like white, Christian, God-fearing, kind of like what the founders of the Constitution thought male was, or you were something else. And so everyone, monsters, women, old people, even old men, all of them were lumped in the not male category. So that's the thing I play with in that class, what it means to be not male, not dominant in the Middle Ages. And that's also in some ways a class about theory, but it's really a class about gender, but it's really a class about medieval literature. And animals, there's got stuff on animals, that's fun. So that's what I'm doing. I only get to teach one class a semester because I'm DUS, and this is a huge frustration for me. And it's one of the reasons I don't get to teach all the fun other stuff.
What literature do you not like or not enjoy studying?
I can't read anything where anyone gets killed in the first pages and it's funny, so I'm not into like mystery novels. Like the premise of mystery novels is that somebody is dead, and I think so much about death, obviously, that I can't read mystery novels. And I know that they're one of the great genres that is just closed to me. I also can't watch Game of Thrones because it's too violent. I can read but not watch Game of Thrones. I can't watch casual killing because I think too much about what it means for someone to have lived and wanted to live, to be able to watch someone get killed and have it just happen. So that really limits me in some sorts of readings. Horror literature, such as it is, not so much. That's pretty much it. I'll read anything else. Perhaps we are at an end? I'll hang out for a little while before Roger goes and tells me what I need to do next. And I have office hours this afternoon, which are usually by appointment, but I seem to not have that many appointments if you need something. I should be in my office between about 15 minutes from now and 2:30. Thank you all for coming.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.